So, Archie, let's start. Obviously, the opioid crisis, it's in the news on a daily basis, but particularly so this week because of hearings on the Hill. But let's start first with where you as an attorney and your firm and your associates are positioned, the theory of the case that you guys are pursuing, because there's multiple players that it seems to me one could go after in terms of the chain of title, I guess, of these opioids and who had responsibility for what by the time that it gets down to the end user. And there's also on the other side of that, there seems to me to be varied options as to who could be the primary plaintiffs in these cases. Let's start with from the plaintiff's perspective. Your theory is, and you guys have been approaching it on a county level. Why the county level as opposed to, let's say, the state attorney generals like we saw in the tobacco settlement?
Well, a couple of reasons, Sam. Number one, the federal government funds Medicare, and the states and federal government share in Medicaid for the indigent. What happens in these particular cases is much of the expense that falls outside the government health care subsidies falls on the shoulders of the cities and towns and counties themselves, whether it's the city jail serving as a hospital room in many cases for people with a drug problem, all the way through the coroner's office having to deal with the taking care of the folks after they die. So much of the expense falls on the shoulders, and these cities, counties, and towns have standing to bring claims for those economic losses in the past and going forward.
I mean, talk about that. The claims in the past, seem somewhat self-evident, I guess. I mean, you're dealing with all the problems that would come from folks who've been addicted. But talk about, and I don't know if people actually spend time thinking about this cohort of people who, and we'll talk about how they got hooked on these things, but who got hooked on these things, they continue through life. I mean, just tease that out for us, because I'm not sure that people spend that much time thinking about the implications going forward.
Yeah, so incredibly, the work that an opioid drug does on the human brain is really irreversible. And if at best you can correct it to some extent, but once one becomes addicted to an opiate, it's a life. It lasts for the rest of your life. Their statistics show that even the wealthiest of families, once a person gets hooked on opiates, they can have the best treatment, the best care, and they at best have a 50-50 chance at living a natural course of their life, just because it's such a strong changer of the infrastructure and of how the brain works.
Okay, and so let's talk about the before we get to the hearings this week, and I know that you have a hearing in regards to your case. Tell us about the other side of this. Now, there's been stories about the manufacturers of opioids, and then we know that it goes from there into the distributors of opioids. And then down to the doctors and then the end users and I guess the pharmacies. Where along that spectrum have you, as attorneys, decided to focus your attention?
Well, we're focusing our attention on the people that have yet to be held accountable for their misconduct, and that's the manufacturers and distributors. Doctors and pharmacies that have been guilty along that supply chain have been closed. Many of them have gone to prison. And the regulatory boards of pharmacy and medicine regulate those. Our theory of the case is that under the Controlled Substances Act, Sam, the manufacturers and distributors should share an obligation to monitor levels of shipment and report those levels of shipment that are outside the norm, outside that which is reasonable for a given population, both in terms of size or frequency And those are the parameters that the manufacturing distributors have an obligation to report to the DEA. And if indeed they find it to be a suspicious order, they have the authority to halt the shipment. And we say that they should have halted them. And it's a state by state, county by county, distributor by distributor analysis. But they clearly oversupplied the marketplace and addicted millions of people. 62,000 people died last year as a result of opioid overdose. And the CDC statistics state that 4 out of 5 people who are on heroin started with a prescription drug. So it's this continuum of the prescription drug starting it, then they go to heroin, fentanyl, and carfentanil. In that continuum, that the negligence and really wantonness of the defendants to abide by the rules of the Controlled Substances Act addicted these people, and they knew they were going to do it. And so we lay the blame for the tragedy that's occurred at the feet of the manufacturers and distributors for failing to follow the law. And to be clear, these distributors, we're talking about, there's 3 or 4 major ones of these distributors, and they come up, and they certainly were in front of Congress this week. I guess we're talking about McKesson, Cardinal, and there's one or two others. AmerisourceBergen. And they have a statutory requirement, do they not, to assess and to monitor any, I guess, anomalies or anything that would be surprising. I don't know if it reached the level of... It's called a suspicious order. Okay,
yeah.
That is what they have to monitor, and it's based on a set of criteria that includes how many pills are delivered to a certain population, how frequently are they delivered, is it abnormal in terms of volume or size or frequency, and it's their obligation to investigate it if they find it suspicious and halt it if indeed it falls outside the realm of that which is reasonable.
And as far as I understand it, these entities, these distributors, not only did not meet their statutory obligation, but they tried to actively avoid meeting that statutory obligation.
Correct. Yeah, what they would do, there was a letter written by Joe Rannazzisi, who was the chief investigator for the DEA back in the mid-2000s. In 2007, actually in 2006, he wrote a letter outlining exactly what their duties were. In 2007, he wrote a follow-up letter saying, you're gaming the system. And they were gaming the system by sending in the reports of suspicious orders, but taking no action, making no phone calls, making no investigation. We are going to be reviewing documents and data and taking testimony, and we know from past experience, because we have former DEA and investigators on retainer, we know that the companies would make phone calls to the pharmacy, but not do an investigation as to the shipment. So the records showed a report, they showed a phone call, but it was not a phone call with any intent to prosecute or enforce the obligation they had under the law to not ship excessive supplies of opioids.
That's fascinating. So, all right, well, we got to take a break. When we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about what we know in terms of these distributors and their meeting their statutory obligations, and what they had to tell Congress this week, and what you will be telling a judge, what you told a judge this week in regards to this case. All that and more will return in just a moment. I'm Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire. We'll be right back.